Hello everyone, welcome back to this second screencast. What you're going to see in a moment is information regarding our next unit of study, the New Imperialism 1800 through 1914, except it's going to involve the continent of Africa. As I said to you in the previous screencast, please take careful note of it because on Tuesday I'm going to be putting questions into Google Classroom regarding it. I also included in this announcement a copy of the Google Slides presentation I'm going to go over. Please make a copy of it and place it in your folder in Drive. And going through this information, and I talked about this person in the last screencast, King Leopold II of Belgium. He is associated with, of course, the Scramble for Africa. He felt that establishing a colony there was important for his nation, Belgium, and what he did in 1876 is he established his own holding company, his own private entity, and he hired this individual, Henry Morton Stanley, who was to go to Africa on his behalf and to establish a colony in the Congo. And what's so ironic about Leopold II of Belgium is he never stepped foot in this colony in Africa that he established. Now, what we also associate with Henry Morton Stanley is the discovery of this one person who I talked about previously, Dr. Livingstone, who was a missionary doctor from Scotland who had explored, mapped out extensively the interior of Africa. But what happens with him is that he disappears. He just left one day, never returned. People had him for lost, presumed dead. But Henry Morton Stanley, in setting up this colony for Leopold in the Congo, goes in search of him, and he finds him in 1869. And there's the classic phrase or greeting when he sees him, Dr. Livingstone, I presume. Getting back to Leopold, though, in 1882, he forms a company called the International African Association. This was his private holding company, and it's going to control much of the Congo. So much so that by 1882, it had secured 900,000 square miles of territory. Okay, part of it involving the Congo River. And again, you think about the advantages that the Europeans had, steam, the steamboat, and they would use this to go up and down the Congo River. Now, what's going to also happen in this scramble for territory in Africa is a competition. So much so that by 1884, the German Prime Minister, Otto von Bismarck, which we've talked about previously, is going to call for a meeting known as the Berlin Conference. And out of that is going to be certain rules that they're going to have to abide by, the Europeans, if they want to establish colonies in Africa. The first is that no nation could stake a claim on the continent without notifying other nations. The second rule was that territory could not be claimed unless it was occupied. So those are the two rules that the Europeans had to abide by if they wanted to establish a colony in Africa. One, no nation could stake a claim on the continent without notifying other nations. And the second, territory could not be claimed unless it was occupied. What is tragic about the Berlin Conference, though, is that not one person from Africa was invited to attend this meeting, even though it was about their future. Now, another topic regarding the new imperialism in Africa has to do with Egypt, in the northeastern part of Africa, in particular, the building of the Suez Canal, which was organized by a person from France, Ferdinand de Lesseps. The main construction of the Suez Canal was completed in 1867, and it became operational in 1869. And it was a marvel in engineering. It connected the Mediterranean to the Red Sea eventually going to the Persian Gulf. It involved not only the French, but involved Egyptian laborers. There was a company that was established where people bought shares into this building of this canal, held by people from France, people from Egypt. But what eventually happens, though, is Great Britain starts to buy interest in the canal, buying shares. Why are the British so interested in acquiring shares in this canal? Because it would be basically a shortcut to their jewel in their crown, the British crown, that being India. It would be a shortcut. Instead of sailing all the way from England around the continent of Africa going toward India, they could go through the Mediterranean, take the canal, and in essence it'd be a shortcut for them, and it'd be a quicker route, and it was. What eventually does happen, though, is that the Egyptians have trouble paying back construction of the canal. And this is where the British will step in particular through the efforts of their Prime Minister, Benjamin Disraeli, in 1874, and they'll buy up all really the remaining shares in the canal. And what's going to happen is that the people of Egypt are going to resent it. The idea of the British controlling the canal, it was a symbol of pride for them. There's going to be uprisings. There's going to be a violent one in 1882. And what it's going to eventually lead to is that the British are going to invade and occupy Egypt. And they're going to send their troops there, their navy there. And for the next 72 years, Britain stationed troops in Egypt and effectively controlled the Egyptian government, making the country into a virtual colony, Egypt. And if you think about European control of Africa, by 1914, the start of the First World War, there was only 2 African nations that remained independent. One on the western side and northern part, that being Liberia, settled by former U.S. slaves, and the other on the eastern side, Ethiopia, which was able to remain independent because of its ruler, Menelik II, who actually hired Europeans to come to his country to train his army, as well as build roads and bridges, so when the Europeans tried to take over his country, they would be able to fight them back, and they did. They were able to resist them. The Italians were unsuccessful in taking over Ethiopia. And you can see with the rest of the map here, you could see where the British were able to control certain areas in the north, Egypt, Sudan, going down the southern part of Africa, the French in the northwestern part, Algeria, Morocco. But you also had Germany down here, Portugal, Spain as well up here. So this is what the continent of Africa looked like in terms of control by the Europeans by the year 1914. What we also associate with this new imperialism, in particular Southern Africa and Great Britain, is this man, Cecil Rhodes. He was a British imperialist who is going to make huge profits out of Africa's natural resources. And I'll talk about that in a moment. Also, the founder of the state of Rhodesia, bearing his name in Africa, which in essence he's going to invade militarily and occupy. And what Rhodes had, as represented in this cartoon, the Rhodes Colossus, was this dream of the British controlling the entire continent of Africa. And if you think about the size of Africa for a moment, it's 3 times the size and territory than the United States of America, 3 times the size of the United States. And you could see he's holding in his hands railroad tracks because he had this dream of building a railroad in the northern part in Cairo, going all the way down to Cape Town in the southern part. The railroad was never built, but it was this whole idea of controlling territory in Africa as a ways of doing so. And what the Europeans also did in looking at at imperialism closer is that they're going to conquer their natural resources such as copper, rubber, and tin. But they're also going to change drastically the infrastructure, the inside part of the continent. For farmers, African farmers in particular, they're going to have to change what they're going to grow in terms of crops. They're going to be forced to grow cash crops. One crop that they'll grow would be peanuts. But thinking about this idea of the Europeans in improving the infrastructure of the interior of Africa in terms of transportation and communication, they're going to construct roads and bridges, lay thousands of miles of railroad in order to facilitate the movement of goods and people across the African continent. They're also going to build the telegraph line. They're going to lay lines. These improvements in infrastructure not only helped the Europeans better exploit Africa's natural resources, but it also allowed them greater political control over the African people and their countries. And there was two ways that they ruled the areas of Africa. Indirect rule. Colonies were given a degree of internal autonomy, such as Nigeria here. The British will practice the idea of direct rule, whereas you have the idea of indirect rule, would be practiced here in Nigeria, but direct rule with Senegal, where the colony was directly administered by the colonizer. Now, in southern Africa, what we have here is we have the involvement of the Dutch. Dutch first arrived in the Cape Colony in the late 17th century with the Dutch East India Company, and they begin to settle the Cape. What you eventually have, though, is something in South African history known as the Great Trek, 1835 to 1843. This involved the British. The British start to encroach on this territory, and I'll tell you why in a moment. These people that participate in the Great Trek are known as the Boers. They were Dutch farmers or Afrikaners who felt that the British were violating their natural rights, their right to land. So they'll undertake this Great Trek from 1835 to 1843, where you'll see about 12,000 Boers in ox-drawn wagons that will cross the Orange River and eventually move away from the southern part of Africa. And basically, they will found two states of their own, the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. But what's going to happen, though, later on, is you're going to have the discovery of diamonds and gold in 1867, discovered in southern Africa in the areas that the Boers controlled. And the British are going to become very interested in the discovery of these two items, diamonds and gold. And what's going to happen, it's going to lead to the Boer War, which is going to take place between 1899 and 1902. The Dutch and British are going to fight for control over the Cape, and the British are going to prevail. The British are going to prevail because of, again, the amount of troops that they could bring in from other parts of their empire, the weaponry that they had, such as the Maxim machine gun. And what's going to eventually happen by 1910 is the British are going to establish the Union of South Africa, okay, which will exist for some time. So again, going back to the beginning here, please review this information regarding our new unit of study, Africa, in relation to the new imperialism 1800 through 1914. On Tuesday, you'll be getting questions in Google Classroom about it. If you have any questions in the interim, please feel free to contact me tomorrow during office hours, as well as by email. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.